Chapter 1. The Forgotten Streets of Dinar 7. The planet Dinar 7 was a graveyard of forgotten ambitions, rotting husk of what had once been a thriving galactic trade hub. Once, its markets had glittered with wealth. Its spaceports had been filled with the hum of ships from every corner of the known universe, and its streets had been paved with the hopes of countless travelers seeking fortune. But now, all that remained were shadows and hunger. The fuel wars had ravaged the economy, corporate interest had drained the last resources, and the elites had fled to richer systems, leaving behind only the desperate, the broken, and the unwanted. What had once been a shining beacon of commerce was now a dying world, a place where people sold what little they had left to survive their possessions, their pride, their bodies. The lower districts of Tezhari Prime, once filled with vibrant life, had turned into a slum of broken neon lights and shattered glass. The streets smelled of burnt wires, rust, and unwashed bodies, and the alleys echoed with the sounds of suffering muted cries, the low murmurs of criminals making back-alley deals, the quiet whimpers of those who had given up. It was in this place, amidst the ruins of forgotten lives, that Jonas Voss found himself wandering. He wasn't from Dinar 7. He had no ties to this world, no debts to its people. He was a drifter, a man who had spent the last decade moving from one star system to another, fixing broken ships, patching up failing engines, and working odd jobs just to keep his own ship the horizon's edge running. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't a savior. He had learned long ago that in places like these, you didn't get involved. You kept your head down, you did your job, and you moved on before the rot of a dying world dragged you under. But then he saw her. She was sitting on the cold, grimy ground, her back against the metal wall of a half-collapsed building, her body wrapped in the remnants of what had once been fine clothing. Torn, filthy, barely covering her. She was alien, a Zalari, her skin a deep shade of cerulean, her silver eyes dim with exhaustion and hunger. Her kind were known across the galaxy for their beauty, their elegance, their natural grace. But there was no grace left in her now, only desperation. She was starving. Her limbs were thin, too thin, her ribs faintly visible beneath her delicate frame. Her silver hair, which should have shimmered in the dim neon lights of the city, was dull, tangled, lifeless. But it was her eyes that stopped him in his tracks. There was no anger in them, no hatred, only hunger, desperation, resignation, and worse than that, acceptance. Jonas had seen that look before, in war zones, in refugee camps, in places where people had lost everything and had stopped expecting kindness. She wasn't begging. She wasn't pleading. She had already given up. She wasn't alone. There were figures nearby, shadows lurking in the alley, watching her. Predators waiting to see if she would survive long enough for them to take whatever was left. A merchant stood in front of her, a fat, sneering man with greasy hair and a belly that spoke of a life without hunger. He held a small pouch in his hand, ration pills, the cheap kind, the kind that barely kept a person alive but were better than nothing. And she was offering herself in exchange. Jonas couldn't hear the words from where he stood, but he didn't need to. He had seen enough in his life to know. The merchant's laugh was what made his hands clench into fists. The man threw the pouch at her feet, mocking, shaking his head as he turned away. She didn't react. She simply sat there, unmoving, her silver eyes staring at the food that had just been tossed to the ground like garbage. Jonas felt something cold settle in his chest. This was wrong. This was so wrong. And no one else cared. The passers-by ignored her, walking past as if she didn't exist. The slum was filled with suffering, and she was just one more forgotten soul among thousands. But Jonas wasn't like them. And before he even realized what he was doing, he was moving. The merchant barely noticed him at first. Jonas wasn't a large man, but he carried himself differently than the starving wretches of Dinar 7. His jacket was worn but sturdy, his boots scuffed but solid. He didn't shuffle like the desperate, didn't slink like the criminals who prowled the streets looking for their next victim. He walked with purpose. And when the merchant finally looked up and saw the expression on Jonas's face, his sneer faltered. "You got a problem, off-worlder?" the merchant asked, his voice thick with arrogance, as if he couldn't imagine why someone like Jonas would even bother to stop. Jonas didn't answer him. Instead, he crouched down in front of the Zalari woman, meeting her silver eyes directly. She didn't react at first, didn't move. "Are you hungry?" he asked, his voice calm. She blinked, slow, as if she hadn't expected to be spoken to, as if she hadn't expected anyone to acknowledge her existence. She hesitated, then gave the smallest, almost imperceptible nod. Jonas reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small metal container. He unscrewed the lid, revealing real food. Not ration pills, not synthetic protein blocks. Real, solid food. A compact meal, sealed and preserved. The kind that off-world workers carried with them, nutrient-dense, filling, enough to sustain someone properly. He set it down in front of her. "Eat," he said. For a second, she just stared at it, as if she couldn't believe it was real. Then she moved. Her hands were shaking as she reached out, her fingers hesitant, as if she expected the food to be snatched away the moment she touched it. Jonas said nothing. He just watched as she picked up the container, lifted it to her lips, and took the first bite. And that was when he saw it. The way her eyes widened, the way her entire body shuddered as real food touched her tongue for the first time in who knew how long. She ate fast, too fast, her hands trembling as she swallowed each bite like she was afraid it would disappear. Jonas waited. When she had finished half the meal, he gently reached out and placed a hand on hers, stopping her. She froze. "You need to slow down," he said softly. "If you eat too fast after starving, your body won't handle it well." She stared at him. A moment passed. Then, finally her lips parted. Her voice was hoarse, barely more than a whisper. "Why?" Jonas tilted his head slightly. "Why what?" Her silver eyes locked onto his, searching, as if trying to understand. "Why are you helping me?" Jonas was silent for a long moment. Then, finally, he exhaled. "Because no one else did." And in that moment something changed. She wasn't just another starving woman in the gutter anymore. She was a person. And Jonas had just made himself responsible for her, whether he meant to or not. Far behind them, in the shadows of the alley, the watchers stirred. The merchant was gone, but others had taken notice. This was no longer just an act of kindness. This was a disruption. In the streets of Dinar, Seven did not forgive those who disrupted the balance. Jonas didn't know it yet, but by helping her, he had just started a war. Chapter 2. A Debt Written in Hunger. The streets of Tezhari Prime were a graveyard of the forgotten, a place where the strong preyed upon the weak, where survival was a currency far more valuable than credits. The moment Jonas had broken the silence, the moment he had dared to acknowledge the starving Zalari woman as something more than an object, he had done more than just feed a stranger. He had marked himself. Jonas didn't care about the eyes watching from the shadows, the hungry, greedy gazes of those who had been waiting for the woman to break, waiting for her to become desperate enough to accept the worst of offers. He didn't care about the merchant who had thrown away the ration pouch with a sneer, or the low-ranking enforcers of the Black Moss Syndicate who prowled these streets, making sure their investments remained profitable. All he cared about was the woman sitting before him, her frail hands gripping the food as if it might vanish, her silver eyes flickering between suspicion and disbelief. She was still starving, still far from safe, but the moment she had taken her first bite of real food, Jonas had seen something reignite in her. She wasn't just accepting the inevitable anymore. She was fighting to exist again. Jonas stood slowly, stretching his shoulders before glancing around. He could still feel the eyes on them, and he knew that he had seconds, maybe minutes, before trouble arrived. "You got a name?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. She hesitated, licking her cracked lips before murmuring, "Syria?" Jonas nodded. "All right, Syria. We need to move. Now." Her fingers tightened around the food, her body still trembling with weakness, but she nodded. She understood. Because on Dinar 7, a man who showed kindness was a man who had just painted a target on his back. Jonas reached down, offering her his hand. Syria hesitated again then. Slowly, she took it. Her grip was weak, but not broken. She was still alive. For now, Jonas knew the slums of Tezhari Prime better than he should. He had only arrived a few days ago, looking for ship parts, thinking he would leave in less than a week. But he had been in places like this before, planets that had been left to rot, places where desperation had turned into an economy of suffering. The same rules always applied. Don't get involved. Don't ask questions. Walk away. He had broken all 3 of those rules today, and now he had to deal with the consequences. Syria moved beside him, unsteady but determined, her bare feet silent against the cracked pavement. She didn't ask where they were going. She just followed. Jonas didn't take her to the upper districts, too risky. He didn't take her to any of the safe houses used by offworlders, either too obvious. Instead, he led her through a winding maze of forgotten corridors, past rusted-out vendor stalls, and the remnants of neon signs that still flickered weakly in the darkness. Finally, they reached an old maintenance structure, one of the many buildings that had once been part of the city's infrastructure before it was abandoned to decay. The door was rusted, the walls cracked, but it still stood. Jonas unlocked the entrance manually, pressing a hidden switch under the metal frame. With a hiss, the security override engaged, and the door groaned open, revealing a dimly lit interior filled with scattered tools, storage crates, and a small cot against the wall. It wasn't much, but it was safe. Syria hesitated in the doorway, her silver eyes flickering with uncertainty. "You live here?" she asked. Jonas smirked. "Temporarily." She didn't press further. She stepped inside, her bare feet pressing against the cold floor. The moment the door sealed behind them, Jonas turned, crossing his arms as he studied her properly for the first time. She was too thin, her body still trembling from hunger, but there was something else about her, something off. He had worked with Zalari traders before, knew enough about her kind to realize that she wasn't just a random beggar. Her posture was too controlled. Her eyes were too sharp, even in exhaustion. Jonas had saved a Zalari woman, but who the hell had he actually saved? "You were offering yourself for food," Jonas said bluntly. "That's not normal. Not even here." "Who are you, Syria?" She stiffened. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, finally, she exhaled. "Someone who doesn't exist anymore," she murmured. Jonas's eyes narrowed. "That's a bad answer," he said. "Because someone definitely wants you dead." She flinched, just barely. He saw it. Jonas sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Look, I don't need your full life story. I just need to know if I should be expecting trouble. And right now, my gut says yes." Syria swallowed, her silver eyes lowering. Then, softly, "They took everything from me." Jonas waited. She looked up again, her expression harder now, her voice quieter. "I was supposed to be on a transport to the core worlds. I had a contract, a future everything. Then the ship never made it. Pirates. Smugglers. Someone sold me here. They stripped me of everything. My rank, my identity, my name." Jonas frowned. "And no one came looking for you?" Syria's lips curled bitterly. "I was alone before they took me," she said. "And I'm alone now." Jonas exhaled slowly. Not anymore, he thought. But he didn't say it. Instead, he turned, walking toward one of the supply crates, rummaging inside before pulling out a clean set of clothing, simple but warm. He tossed it to her. "Get changed," he said. "I'll find you real food." She hesitated, then nodded. Jonas stepped out of the room, letting the door seal behind him, his mind already racing. He had 3 priorities now. First, he needed to find out who had sold her, who wanted her erased. Second, he needed to get them both off this damned planet before the wrong people came looking. And third, he needed to figure out why the hell he was risking his life for a woman he had met an hour ago. Jonas sighed, shaking his head. Too late to back out now. He was in this, whether he wanted to be or not. Far above the city, in the glittering towers of the upper districts, a man received a message. A low-ranking enforcer of the Black Moss Syndicate, sweating beneath the cold, unblinking stare of his superior. "We lost her," the enforcer muttered, his voice shaking. She was taken by someone. A human. Offworlder. We don't have a name yet." The room was silent for a long moment. Then, finally, "Find them." The enforcer swallowed. "And if we do?" A pause. Then, "Burn the whole district if you have to." The transmission ended. The hunt had begun. Chapter 3. The Hunt Begins. Jonas knew trouble was coming long before he heard the first whispers. He could feel it in the way the streets had changed, in the way the air seemed thicker, charged with an undercurrent of tension that hadn't been there before. The lower districts of Tezhari Prime were always dangerous, but there were rules even among the desperate, even in a place where survival meant everything. Nobody cared about one starving Zalari woman. Nobody paid attention to someone who had nothing left. Until he had. Now, suddenly, she mattered. And that meant someone wanted her back. Jonas leaned against the rusted frame of an abandoned maintenance building, his eyes scanning the streets below, watching the movement of the crowd. The slums were never empty, never quiet, not really. But now, there were too many new faces, too many people moving with purpose, scanning, watching, looking for something. Or someone. Syria. Jonas exhaled, rubbing his temple. Damn it. He hadn't meant to start something. He hadn't wanted to get involved in whatever hell she had escaped from. But it was too late now. She had eaten, she had rested, she had changed into clean clothes, and she had finally started to look like a person again instead of a ghost. He had given her a chance to stand again, and in doing so, he had chained himself to her fate. And now, the Black Maw Syndicate was coming. Jonas had dealt with syndicates before too many times. There were dozens of them scattered across the galaxy, each controlling different regions of crime, trade, and trafficking. Some were organized, almost like corporations, running things from the shadows with diplomacy and quiet efficiency. The Black Maw wasn't like that. They were the kind of people who burned entire city blocks to make a statement. And Jonas had just stolen one of their possessions. He felt a presence behind him, heard the quiet sound of soft footsteps against the metal flooring. He didn't turn. "You're watching them," Syria said quietly. Jonas nodded. "They're looking for you." She stepped beside him, her arms folded across her chest, her silver eyes scanning the streets below. She was still weak, still recovering, but there was something sharper in her now, something that hadn't been there when he first found her. She had been waiting to die before. Now, she was ready to fight. "They won't stop," she murmured. "Not until they find me." Jonas sighed. "I figured." Syria's fingers clenched at her sides. "I should leave," she said suddenly. "Go far enough away. Get off-world. They'll stop looking if I dash." "No." Syria turned, startled by the hardness in his voice. Jonas didn't look at her. His gaze remained on the street, his jaw tight, his expression unreadable. "You really think they'll stop just because you run?" he asked. "They don't care about distance. They don't care about how far you go. They care about control." Syria hesitated. "They won't just kill you," Jonas continued. "They'll make an example of you. And anyone who helped you." Syria's breath hitched slightly. "Then why did you dash?" "Because I don't walk away from things like this." Jonas finally turned to her, his expression unreadable. "Not anymore." She studied him for a long moment. Then, finally she nodded. "Then what do we do?" Jonas exhaled slowly. He had been thinking about that since the moment he had seen the Syndicate scouts lurking in the alleys. There was only one way to stop something like this. "We make them stop looking," Jonas said. "Permanently." Syria's eyes widened slightly. "You mean dash?" Jonas nodded. "We kill the man who put the price on you." The Syndicate enforcers weren't subtle. Jonas had expected them to be cautious at first, to move through the slums quietly, searching for information, tracking their target without drawing attention. But he had underestimated just how little the Black Maw cared about discretion. They weren't hunting. They were cleansing. The first attack came only an hour after Jonas and Syria had left their hideout. Building 3 blocks away was firebombed. Its occupants burned alive. No survivors. No warnings. The second attack came minutes later. A street vendor who had given Jonas directions was shot in the back of the head. Public. Brutal. Jonas's stomach twisted. They weren't looking for whispers. They were erasing evidence. Syria's face was pale when they ducked into a hidden alley, her silver eyes wide with something close to horror. "They're burning everything," she whispered. "Even people who had nothing to do with me." Jonas clenched his fists. "They want to make an example of you," he muttered. "And they want to make an example of anyone who helped you." Syria's breathing was shaky. "If we don't stop them, Dash, they'll never stop." Jonas had seen this before, on other worlds, with other syndicates. The Black Maw was making a statement. They weren't just punishing Syria. They were showing the entire city what happened when someone defied them. It was a message. And the only way to stop a message like that was to send one back. Jonas turned to Syria, his expression hard as steel. "We need to hit them first." The Black Maw's leader on Dinar 7 wasn't a faceless figure hidden behind layers of secrecy. He wasn't some untouchable crime lord who ruled from the shadows. He was one man, and Jonas knew exactly where to find him. His name was Rivik Torsin, and he operated out of a private penthouse in the upper district, guarded by mercenaries, drones, and enough firepower to level a city block. Taking him down wouldn't be easy, but Jonas had never cared about easy. Syria sat across from him in their temporary hideout, a repurposed shipping container buried in the industrial zones. She had changed again this time into something practical, a fitted black combat suit Jonas had stolen from a dead bounty hunter days ago. "You really think this will work?" she asked, her voice quiet but steady. Jonas smirked. "I think if we don't try, we're dead anyway." Syria exhaled slowly. Then, she nodded. Jonas reached for his weapons, his pulse pistol, his shock knives, the small arsenal he had gathered over the years. He slid a knife across the table toward Syria. She took it. She was ready. And in the next few hours, the Black Moss Syndicate was going to learn why you don't hunt people who fight back. Far above the city, in the towering luxury of the upper district, Rivik Torsin sat in his private lounge, sipping a glass of high-grade off-world liquor, his cybernetic arm gleaming in the low light. A screen flickered in front of him, displaying a live feed of the burning slums below. The enforcer standing beside him shifted uncomfortably. "We still haven't found them, sir." Rivik smirked. "They'll come to us," he said. And in that moment, the power went out. The room plunged into darkness, and Rivik realized, far too late, that he was the prey now. Chapter 4. A Reckoning in Blood. The darkness inside Rivik Torsin's penthouse was absolute, thick, suffocating, wrapping the room in silence as if the very walls were holding their breath. The only light came from the emergency glow strips flickering weakly along the base of the walls, barely illuminating the ornate furnishings and high-end technology that lined the chamber. It was a place meant for comfort, for power, for control. But tonight, it was a prison, and Rivik was trapped inside it. Jonas could feel the tension vibrating through the air like an exposed electrical wire, raw and unstable. The Black Maw enforcers were good, trained professionals who had spent years enforcing the Syndicate's rule through violence and fear, but even they weren't prepared for this. Their cybernetic enhancements, their high-end security, their expensive tech all useless. Because none of it worked in the dark. And that was exactly where Jonas and Syria wanted them. Jonas moved like a shadow, his steps silent, his pistol raised as he slipped through the chaos. The Black Maw guards were fumbling, their optics failing, their augments scrambled by the EMP charge he had detonated moments ago. A single pulse of controlled energy had fried every electronic in the penthouse. The playing field was level now. No cameras. No alarms. No reinforcements. Jonas caught movement to his right, a guard trying to reset his targeting systems, his mechanical fingers twitching as he struggled to bring his weapon to bear. Jonas didn't hesitate. A whisper of plasma fire. A single shot. The enforcer crumpled, a smoking hole in his throat, his body thudding to the marble floor. No screams. No alarms. Just the quiet, choking sound of a dying man. Jonas kept moving. Syria was already ahead of him, her silver eyes glowing faintly in the low light, her blade flashing as she danced between the guards. She moved like she had been born for this, each strike precise, surgical, merciless. The first man never saw her coming. The second barely had time to scream before she was behind him, her knife carving a deep crimson smile across his throat. By the time the third had realized what was happening, she was already gone. Jonas had seen warriors before, had fought alongside soldiers and mercenaries across the galaxy, but this was different. Syria wasn't fighting like a trained assassin. She was fighting like someone who had already died once and refused to die again. Jonas took a breath, steadying himself as they reached the massive double doors at the end of the hall, the entrance to Rivik's personal chambers. The last barrier between them and the man who had ordered her death. Jonas turned to Syria. She was covered in blood, her hands slick with it, her breathing ragged but steady. She had never looked stronger. "You ready?" he asked. Syria wiped her blade against her sleeve, then looked up at him. "Yes." Jonas nodded, raised his boot, and kicked the doors open. The penthouse's main chamber was a vision of decadence and arrogance, a place built by a man who believed he could never be touched. Massive glass windows lined the far wall, offering a view of the city below, a kingdom of neon and steel, all of it ruled through fear and blood. At the center of it all, standing beside his expensive, handcrafted desk, was Rivik Torsin, the Syndicate Lord, the man who had bought and sold Syria like she was nothing more than a commodity. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his cybernetic arm gleaming under the emergency lights, his dark coat lined with gold, a symbol of the wealth he had stolen, the lives he had destroyed. His yellow cybernetic eyes locked onto them, scanning, calculating, and for the first time in his life uncertain, Jonas could see it. The fear. The realization that, for once, he was not in control. "You've made a mistake," Rivik said, his voice calm, measured. "You think this changes anything?" Syria stepped forward, slow, deliberate, her blade still dripping warm blood onto the marble floor. "It changes everything," she said. Rivik smirked, though there was a hint of unease in his expression. "You think killing me will make you free?" He let out a dry chuckle, shaking his head. "The Black Maw is bigger than me. I die, someone else takes my place. You'll still be hunted. You'll still be Dash." Syria lunged. She moved so fast Jonas barely had time to react. One moment, Rivik was speaking. The next, her blade was buried in his side. The Syndicate Lord gasped, his body jerking, his mechanical arm twitching as blood spilled from the wound. Syria leaned in close, her silver eyes cold and merciless. "Then I'll kill them too," she whispered. Rivik tried to swing at her, his cybernetic limb powering up, the built-in plasma cannon whining as it prepared to fire. But Jonas had already moved. His pistol flashed. The plasma round struck Rivik in the shoulder, blowing apart wires and metal, sending the massive man stumbling back against his desk, his damaged limb sparking uselessly. Syria didn't hesitate. She drove her knife into his chest, twisted it, and ripped it free. Rivik Torsin, Syndicate Lord of the Black Maw, collapsed to the ground, gasping, his blood pooling around him. Syria stared down at him, her expression unreadable. Jonas watched as she knelt beside him, as she pressed her blade to his throat, and as Rivik choked on his final breaths, Syria spoke softly. "You thought I was nothing," she said. She cut. And the Black Maw's rule ended with a whisper. They burned everything. The Syndicate's records, its weapons, its wealth, all of it went up in flames as Jonas and Syria walked away, their bodies covered in soot and blood, their faces marked with the weight of what they had done. By the time the Black Maw enforcers realized what had happened, by the time they tried to retaliate, Jonas and Syria were already gone. The Horizon's Edge was waiting for them at the docks, its engines humming like a heartbeat, its cargo hold stocked with enough stolen Syndicate credits to last a lifetime. Syria stood at the bottom of the ramp, staring at the ship, her hands clenching at her sides. "You coming?" Jonas asked. She looked at him, really looked at him, then exhaled. And for the first time in a long, long time, she smiled. "Yes." Jonas grinned. "Good. Because I could use a co-pilot." Syria let out a breath, almost a laugh, before following him up the ramp. And as the ship lifted off, leaving Tezhari Prime behind, she knew. She wasn't lost anymore. She had a future again. And for the first time in a long, long while, she was free.